It's Wednesday, it's 11:15 and we're live in Westminster.
The sad reality here is we cannot build our way out of this problem. We are going to build, we are going to maintain the cells that we have, and it still won't be enough.
Why 14,000 new places will not end the prison crisis. Should those new jails and some of the promised 1.5 million new homes be built on the greenbelt? We'll hear from a campaigner who thinks not. Kemi Badenoch isn't shy about the difficulties she experienced growing up in Nigeria.
I was born here, but I grew up in a place where fear was everywhere. You cannot understand it unless you've lived it.
But is she, as the Nigerian Vice President has said, denigrating her nation? And the Conservative leader will take on Keir Starmer at Prime Minister's Questions. We'll bring you that live at noon. Joining us today, Labour MP Siobhan McDonough, Conservative MP Bradley Thomas, Politics Joe's Ava Santina Evans and Conservative commentator Albi Amankona. This is Politics Live. Let's start with this headline in The Guardian. Union anger over Labour government's insulting 2.8% public sector pay plan. Pay review bodies will make final recommendations on proposed rises for teachers, NHS staff and other workers. My opening question to the panel, starting with you, Siobhan. Is 2.8% as a pay rise good enough?
2.8 is the beginning, it's not the end of the process. So what we're actually going through is, you know, that rope of people arguing on both sides of it. As I understand it, 2.8 is what the government have submitted to the Pay Review Board, and now the unions, other groups will put in what they regard as fair,
yes,
and the body itself will determine the suggested pay increase.
So should the unions just threaten to strike and they'll get more?
Well, no, because the argument is going to be had about what is affordable, what can be delivered, and things have to be considered in the round. Look, I went to the funeral of my history teacher last week, Mrs. Fowler. She changed my life. She made it possible for me to have the confidence to go to university. So if I had no restrictions, I would pay teachers a huge amount of money to do what they do because they transform lives. The balance is how much can the country afford and what is reasonable. And so we're in the mix of that discussion at the moment.
Is 2.8% as a pay rise good enough for public sector workers like teachers?
Well, everybody wants to see public sector workers get a pay rise. Siobhan is right in that this is the start of the process, but what the government have got to do is own the process. So we saw a few months ago that the government gave a 22% pay rise to junior doctors. That was 10 times the rate of inflation.
It ended the strikes, though, didn't it?
But in recent weeks, we've also seen the government make the prospect of strikes much easier because they've lowered the threshold with their employment bill. So Labour have got themselves into a real bind here where, you know, they've sort of announced 22% for doctors a few weeks ago, 2.8% is on the table here. Now, they've got to own the process, and they're actually making it much more difficult to get value for money for the taxpayer too. With the junior doctors, there were no productivity enhancements associated with that. Labour need to stand up, find the courage to stand up to the unions.
Well, a bit like the last Conservative government, and they didn't own the process at all. They didn't even give any recommendations. At least the government departments here have recommended this as a pay rise. The 5.5% awarded by this government was on the back of recommendations made.
The reality is Labour are in government now. We are seeing them make choices that are getting themselves...
So you want them to do something that the last Conservative government didn't do?
Labour are in government. They have to own the process, and we saw a few weeks ago...
We are owning the process, aren't we? We've made... the government has made its suggestion. The unions will make theirs.
But we saw a few weeks ago...
And the pay review body... Do you know, I have not met anybody who is disappointed that the junior doctors' strike is at an end.
But the point
is...
We
know that we have got to tackle those waiting lists, and the doctors are back at work.
This is not going to tackle the waiting list. What we're going to see is we're going to see junior doctors come back next year.
Don't talk over each other. Let Siobhan finish that and I'll come back to you, Bradley.
So, I mean, I think that Wes Streeting did exactly the right thing, and I have never met anybody who thinks Wes Streeting, our health secretary, is short on courage.
Look, on that courage point, Labour rolled over to the unions. 22%, no productivity enhancements. We will find next year that those who have already been emboldened will come back asking for more. And in this case here, Labour are making it much easier for public sector workers to strike without delivering value for money for the taxpayer. Nobody wants to see a pay rise denied to public sector workers, but we have to strike the right balance. And Labour have got themselves tied up in knots because they're in the pocket of the unions.
Right. Well, do you think Bradley's got a point in terms of building a rod, I should say, for their own backs with that 5.5% pay rise broadly for public sector workers and 22% for the junior doctors?
Well, I do have to laugh when you talk about productivity enhancements, because it's almost like you're talking about a machine rather than people. And just on your point there about the Employment Rights Bill making it easier for people to strike, that is actually not true. It just stripped back some of the more draconian legislation that the Conservatives added in during the last administration, which meant that we actually had trade union laws that were in line with Russia. That was how terrible it was. Look, the country wants to pay public sector workers. They want to see a wealth tax, and they would like to see that money go to people who are actually aiding the country grow. Most of the country. If
I don't
you look
want
at
to see
the
a wealth
polling,
tax.
all right, well, you're the only
public.
one.
I don't think I'm the only one.
Overwhelmingly, the public poll very well when it comes to a wealth tax. Why on earth do big conglomerates like Amazon get away with paying very little tax, and then we're sitting here having a discussion about whether to pay workers 2% extra?
But in the absence of that wealth tax, what would you do then with the pay rise?
I mean, that's not even up for discussion. The wealth tax needs to be in, and you need to pay your workers.
I mean, industrial action in the NHS is estimated to have cost taxpayers around £1.7 billion during 2023 and 2024. And some of the unions cited in response to this 2.8% prospect pay rise say it's an insult and won't cover the cost of living.
I'll tell you who it is an insult to: private sector workers. As someone who works in the private sector, I find it utterly depressing that we're talking about pay rises that aren't linked to productivity increases, that aren't linked to targets being met, that aren't linked to the users of services being happy with their services, and that aren't linked to an overall improvement in the state. How can you sit here and say that we should be paying people more when public services have never been in a poorer state? As somebody who works in the private sector,
But why is that?
if my day-to-day delivery was as bad as some of the services in the public sector, I wouldn't have the gall to ask for a pay rise.
Albie, are you saying that nurses have stopped working over the past year? Or is there a wider conversation here about how services haven't been funded properly and they're not able to deliver the care that they'd like to?
We're not back at the productivity levels that we were pre-pandemic.
Well, I tell you, whenever I sit on the picket line with any of those nurses, any of those doctors, they look tired, they look haggard, they cannot work anymore.
What about this link to reform, Siobhan? That was the main criticism, giving money. In fact, Keir Starmer said no more money without reform. Well, in fact, that didn't happen. There's a lot more money, certainly for the NHS, before reform. What do you say in response to that?
Well, the government is currently considering a 10-year reform programme of the NHS. The main drift of it is it's not new stuff, it's stuff that we've tried to tackle before, which is getting services out of hospital and into the community, looking at social care. But everybody is absolutely right. Unless we change the way we do things, not only is it going to be a productivity issue, it's going to be the issue about the quality of service. Nobody who goes into A&E, certainly in London, which is where my experience of an evening, and sees the queue of elderly people there, distressed, needing care, thinks the way it's happening at the moment is right. We need change, and we need to pay people the right money for the job.
Does that reassure you?
Not really, because the Conservatives spoke a good game about that. Now Labour's talking a good game about doing that. I just think if we look at public service delivery over the last 30 years, which is the span of my lifetime, we've seen taxes go up and public services go down.
But who was that under? That was under the Conservatives.
And
it was
Labour.
also during a period. It was
years.
also during a period of austerity.
Before the programme, we were talking about what was the difference, feeling with this Labour government as opposed to 97. And can I just say, Labour in 1997, over that period, transformed the NHS. 18 weeks from diagnosis to treatment, 4-hour waits in A&E.
How did you do that in part? You put up income tax at one point, and yet you ruled that out in the manifesto in the same way that the Tories did during their manifesto.
We did that through a reforming health secretary who brought in targets. So if doctors had waiting lists of over 6 months, people would be treated somewhere else in the NHS. We brought waiting lists down and we took some of the pressure off.
Right.
But those reforms couldn't be sustained over 14 years of a Conservative government, and things have gone back to where they were pre-97.
Bradley?
Well, in the summer, when this government was elected, they inherited a pretty decent economic environment.
wow.
They did. No, they did. No, they did.
But literally, it had just improved in the sort of previous 6-9 months.
Allow me to make the point, right? The economy was growing, inflation was down.
But not per capita.
We had just come through the pandemic, which saw £400 billion of borrowing to prevent complete economic devastation only a few years ago. What we've seen since July is a government take decision after decision that is not politically astute, slashing winter fuel, £40 billion of additional tax borrowing, and they talk about.
Do you think anyone actually buys this?
I think
Do you think anyone at home actually buys that the economy grew and that Labour inherited a great economy?
What the public are buying is that they can see through the deceit. You know, Labour promised they would not put up taxes. They have. They're not prepared to reform public services because there is no political will.
Goes into an A&E and sees what is going on there, knows that things have to change and know things have got really bad.
If the unions don't sign up to that sort of reform package, should it be no to the pay rise?
Well, I think at this stage it's got to be about negotiation, hasn't it? It's got to be about what is actually best for the NHS. And there's always an argument about targets, but I've never known anything other than a target that makes a difference.
Well, let's talk about one part of the public sector that really has been struggling, because the Justice Secretary has today announced that the government is going to create 14,000 prison places by 2031. This, of course, follows the decision by Shabana Mahmood to release thousands of prisoners early to prevent the whole system being overwhelmed. Now, there is some money, £2.3 billion worth of funding over the next 2 years, and there's a plan to open 4 new prisons in the next 7 years. Will it be enough to solve the crisis ongoing in the long term? Let's have a listen to Shabana Mahmood.
Even though we will be increasing supply, even though we are investing in maintenance so that we don't lose cells to dilapidation, on their own that won't be enough. What we've published is both the supply line that shows that going up, but also the demand line, which that is to say the demand for prison places, which is going up at a much higher rate. The sad reality here is we cannot build our way out of this problem. We are going to build, we are going to maintain the cells that we have, and it still won't be enough.
Bradley, do you agree with that?
I disagree. What we've seen this morning is the Justice Secretary touring media studios and effectively announcing funding that Conservatives had pledged, £2.3 billion. In the last few years, in the last few years, we've seen 2 new prisons open. There's another due to open next year as well. They were announced by Conservatives. What we've seen instead under this government are thousands of violent, in many cases, career criminals released onto the streets. Well, the government say that because there was a lack of capacity in the
bursting point.
Yeah, but you know what? I'm not also.
Did you not release prisoners early as well, though? Was that not a Rishi Sunak
I'm also not
idea?
going to apologise for Conservatives putting criminals in jail.
OK.
Well, we've seen Labour release criminals onto the street. They're popping champagne corks and saying that they are now converted Labour voters. And during the last 14 years, time after time, Labour refused to back tougher sentencing when they had the opportunity in Parliament.
Well, there you go, Siobhan.
Oh, this is just poor stuff, isn't it? I found an amazing figure when I was looking at, researching what I was going to say today or what I needed to know. And do you know, even 5 months in the Labour government, we've provided as many extra prison places as the Tories did in 14 years, 500. So the idea, the prison estate was...
How did you provide those places?
Was 99% full when we were elected.
All right, but there is a philosophical question, because you've heard from Shabana Mahmood. It's still not going to be enough. She's going to create 14,000 new places. There's going to have to be a complete rethink on sentencing. I know there's this review from the former Conservative Justice Secretary David Gauke, but broadly, should we just keep building more prison places, or should we have more lenient sentences?
I think we have to do a combination of the two. It's a bit like the conversation about the NHS before, isn't it? About reform and about paying staff more. In the case of prisons, it's about we want our prisons to be effective. We don't want people going back to prison time and time again.
Well, Bradley, you balked at that idea.
So, I mean, surely prison has 2 purposes. For justice, so that people who act badly have a sentence and actually are held to account, and to try and make people into a situation where they don't commit crime again. So it has to be both.
Yeah, I mean, I did balk at the idea of being more lenient on sentencing. We need to be tougher on crime. We've seen
have more people going to prison.
Yeah, well, if people are serious criminals, they need to go to prison.
And surely it depends what the crime
But
is.
Siobhan, we've also heard the minister say that they believe 1/3 of people should not be in prison. This doesn't wash with the general public when career criminals are being released back onto the streets.
Well,
Ava?
Well, I just think you're sort of speaking in the abstract, aren't you?
Yeah.
It's very easy to say we need to put more people in prison and we should have longer sentences. But actually, when you get down to it, if you've got people who are, say, career shoplifters, putting them away at the minute that they come out of prison and they reoffend, that's actually not good for society at large. And look, I was rather disappointed in this announcement this morning from the Justice Secretary because I thought that Labour had a real opportunity to spend some political capital. They've brought in James Timpson, who famously recruits people who've got spent convictions, and he hires them. I thought they were going to come up with a more holistic approach to rehabilitate prisoners rather than just, you know, building new prisons, which is tired.
Albie?
Well, Labour doesn't have very much political capital to spend because they've got off to such an awful start. I mean, there are farmers protesting in London again today, so that might be the answer to your question about political capital. But coming to the prison question, I was reading some National Audit Office statistics that said that actually by the mid-2020s we needed 20,000 extra prison places. Now this Labour government is suggesting perhaps 14 or 15,000 by the beginning of the next decade. So the capacity that's being built isn't actually keeping up in line with demand. And the Conservatives changed the sentencing guidelines, which I thought was right, but then didn't plan adequately for capacity increases. What was that all about? How can you possibly say we're going to send more people to prison because that's what we believe, because we think punishment is a good thing, and then not build the prerequisite prison places to send those people who are being punished too?
Isn't that exactly what William Hague, the former leader of the Conservative Party, said? The Conservatives want to send more people to prison, but they're not willing to build the places.
I mean, that's a problem, isn't it? If you haven't got the capacity, but you still want to follow through on your crime and punishment agenda.
Look, up until July, when this government was elected, you know, if there was a prison capacity issue, Conservatives still managed to balance this.
But there was.
Hold on, we managed to balance this without releasing thousands of criminals onto the streets.
You didn't.
Yes, we did. That's reality.
You handed over prisons 99% full.
In July, Siobhan, the Justice Secretary announced that thousands of criminals were being released onto our streets.
What happened. Which is things that you were considering, but gratefully for you, the general election came before
I'm sorry,
it had to be done.
Siobhan, you have to own the reality of the decisions that the government
Well, may
has
I just
taken.
ask, so you accept that we do need to build more prisons, we need more prison space, and we need longer and tougher sentences, correct?
Conservatives
Is
have
that
said-
correct, though? No, but Labour should build.
I'm
build.
answering the question. Conservatives have said that if prisons are in our strategic national interest, then we support the building of them. And we
Fantastic.
support
So will
tougher
you now
sentencing.
pledge that you will have a prison in your constituency?
Labour have to own the decisions that they're taking. It's a non-point.
Well, then where you
Well,
put it?
just interestingly, the
I have a
public...
prison in my constituency, by the way.
And you'll
would
make
you
it
have another
bigger.
one? Well, we'll come on to the planning issue in just a moment. The thing is, the government is probably going to have to continue to release prisoners early, aren't they, Siobhan, because of the overcrowding. Whatever they do over the next few years, they'll probably have to do another early prisoner release.
I don't know what the balance is, but that seems like...
I mean, the public don't like that much, surprisingly, Ava. Ipsos survey published in October found over half of Britons opposed releasing certain prisoners early to alleviate overcrowding. But what's the alternative?
Well, no, absolutely. And I thought that the way that Labour actually went about it when they did do the early release was poor. There were many people who weren't alerted to certain, domestic abuse victims or survivors who had their partners out on the town and they didn't know about it. It was rushed through and it was pushed through. However, there are many crimes where people don't necessarily need to be in prison and they need to be rehabilitated.
Do you agree with that, that shoplifting, for example, perhaps should not be a prison offence?
I think it depends on the veracity of the shoplifting. You'll get lots of small businesses across the country talk about how the scourge of shoplifting has such an impact on our bottom line that they're having to raise prices for the consumers. I think it's all very fair and well to have a pop at the Conservatives for not building prisons. The Conservatives are no longer in government. I'm not happy about that. But the point is, the current plans that the Labour Party have do not build capacity in line with the demand of the prisoners that we're going to be sending there. What are we going to do about it? You said earlier on, Siobhan, you wanted more lenient sentences. Do you think the public will forgive you for that?
No, what I want is a balance between making sure that the right people go to prison and actually having the places and having and doing something about trying to ensure that people do not are not released and just do the same crime. I mean, the shoplifting issue, shoplifting has become organised crime. It often isn't just the person who's a bit desperate and goes down and steals a few things. We can argue about whether that person should go to prison or not. It's actually organised crime, and it's actually stopped being policed. So I certainly know in the Co-op round the corner from me, there is repeated organised shoplifting every Sunday night when they get their delivery. And that we have to do something about.
Bradley?
Well, I'm concerned that the government are heading towards more lenient sentencing. Yesterday in the House of Commons, I asked the Justice Secretary if the government will commit not to increasing the prevalence of community sentences, many of which go wholly unserved, and I didn't get an answer on that.
Right, Siobhan?
Well, if it's the right person, I think community sentences can really work.
But will there need to be a lot more investment in rehabilitation, having jobs ready for people to go to if they're released from prison, either early or not?
Well, Ava was making the point about Mr Timpson, who's been appointed as a minister in the Department
Yeah,
of
I think he
Justice.
says about a third of people shouldn't be in prison.
Well, I mean, he's there and he's arguing the case, isn't he?
All right.
There's never one single answer
sounds
to
quite
these
decisive.
actually problems.
Some of these community sentences, 30% of them are served doing online courses. I don't think many people in the public would think it is acceptable for a community sentence to be served with someone flicking through their smartphone doing some kind of training.
Well, let me pick up on something.
Community sentences, what they mean to me is people clearing the rubbish out of back alleys, of tidying up community areas,
It's
of
now
actually
online.
of doing things that actually benefit the local area. And I can assure you, I know loads of community groups who would really benefit from those sorts of projects.
All right, well, let's pick up on something Ava mentioned. This headline in the Daily Telegraph, Angela Rayner, the Housing Secretary, to force plans for new prisons on towns and villages. The MOJ, Ministry of Justice, will be able to bypass councils to build on greenbelt under new laws to tackle jail overcrowding. Is that something you welcome, Bradley?
We've said all along that if it's in our strategic national interest to build prisons, then we should build them, but they have to be in the right locations. We're seeing from the government that they are assaulting the greenbelt because they've got a really overt political approach to planning reform. You know, we're seeing, my constituency is a great example, 89% greenbelt, right? My housing allocation in Bromsgrove is up by 82%. In Birmingham, it's down by 20%. We're seeing the Labour Mayor of London fail to hit their housing target. Whether we're talking prisons or whether we're talking housing, the government are viewing this through a political lens.
Siobhan, have a look at this headline. Angela Rayner to allow building on area of greenbelt bigger than Surrey. The Deputy Prime Minister will set out a planning framework that aims to release more land for house building. She will meet passionate opposition, won't she?
Not from me, she won't. I think that's absolutely right. We have to decide whether we are really seriously going to build infrastructure, whether we're going to build houses. There are currently just under 160,000 children in temporary accommodation in this country. That means one child in every class in London is in temporary accommodation. And unless we start to build at volume, neither of the young people on our panel are ever going to be in a position
Siobhan,
to buy a house.
on Sunday, the Deputy Prime Minister said that this country has plenty of houses. Yet the government are increasing house building targets across the country. You know, 82% increase in my constituency. The two are contradictory.
Who said that there was plenty of houses?
The Deputy Prime
Are
Minister.
they affordable,
though? She said there are
very
plenty.
important,
She said there are
isn't it?
plenty of
But
houses.
it's not true, is it, though, Bradley? That's the point. No one thinks there are enough houses in the country. If we actually look at some of the statistics that I've seen, there's a shortage of between 4 million and 4.3 million homes in the country. So Labour's target of 1.5 million in a parliament is welcome, but it doesn't actually really scratch the surface of what we need. I actually agree with this green belt, grey belt plan, but probably it needs to be double the size of.
Well, someone who doesn't agree with it is Richard Slater, who's in Macclesfield, and he's from the Save Macclesfield Greenbelt campaign. Welcome to you. Richard, what's your concern? What's your concern about Angela Rayner's plan and building on the Greenbelt?
Well, at the moment, there's a million houses that have planning permission, which are yet to be built. And here in Macclesfield, we've got developers who are trying to add additional sites to the local plan on Greenbelt land. And again, we've already got 2,445 houses with planning permission that aren't being built. We've also got a significant amount of properties on the local plan sites, which are 4-bedroom executive homes, which are at the moment unsold and staying empty. The government needs to look at a proper plan of building for first-time buyers, utilising things like units above shops and empty pubs and banks, and converting the town centre empty beds back into beds. People used to live above the shops, and that was what made the town centre. I think really what Ms Rayner needs to do is actually get the million permissions already in situ used up before she starts carving up the greenbelt.
All right, Siobhan?
I think we need to do all the things that the gentleman has identified and more. The crisis is huge. I actually believe, though, there is probably enough land within 10 minutes walk of outer London train stations to build 1 million homes. And this land is not being used by anybody. You don't spend your Sundays there with your kids. It's just in an appalling condition. And we need the homes because we're paying in temporary accommodation. We're paying for the fact that these children aren't going to school. They're not being looked after. I've got a family with a man who has got dementia, who is in temporary accommodation, and we cannot get him a bathroom and a bedroom on the same floor. So he regularly spends his night falling down the stairs trying to get to the bathroom. His condition is worsening. It's going to be a problem for the health service, let alone the distress it causes to him.
So anyone who opposes building on the greenbelt should just be ignored.
Pardon, say that?
So anyone who opposes building on the greenbelt should just be ignored because it's such a crisis?
I don't think that anybody should be ignored in their view. I don't know the details of the Macclesfield case, but I do know in outer London there are swathes of land that are completely unused that people would love to live in. Well, should have the opportunity to do so.
Well, Bradley mentioned that you said it had gone up 82%.
In my constituency.
Yeah, it's gone down in yours, and yet you're a passionate advocate, Siobhan, for building on the green belt or the grey belt, garage forecourts, whatever it is. Why has it gone down in your constituency by 3%? Would you advocate to have more homes built?
Absolutely.
Oh. You would? Yeah. Have you spoken to the Housing Secretary about that?
We need more houses. We will build as many as we can. But there are areas where it's easier to build than more urban ones. I absolutely agree with the gentleman.
Yes,
on
Richard, yes, come back.
About building above shops.
But Joe, yeah, it's easier to build on the greenbelt because it's cheaper for the developers to do that, and that's why the government wants to help the developers do that, is to build on the greenbelt. But here in Macclesfield, we've had 2 high schools which have been demolished to build housing estates on. And now the council are busing people out to Onslow to go to school. So the infrastructure needs to be started. The councils get the builders to put funds forward to bring the infrastructure together. Then the developers say, because they're building on bad land, so here at Macclesfield, they're building on a peat bog. They've come back and said, well, we can't afford to build low-cost houses because of the land conditions. This is from a builder that's got 70 years.
Well, let me put that to our other panellists. I mean, listening to that, I'll be demolishing 2 schools in order to build homes and then busing children to schools that are out of the area. It doesn't sound very sensible.
No, it doesn't sound very sensible, but we've got to ask why schools are being demolished. And actually, in a lot of inner-city London boroughs, we're actually seeing schools closed down because people aren't having children. And a lot of people say the reason they're not able to have children is because they don't have a stable home environment, financial security, so they're not having children. Local schools aren't full, they're closing down and being bulldozed to build more houses. We've got ourselves into a real pickle with housing, planning and infrastructure policy in this country. We need a complete rethink. I think we need to really look at the green belt. We need to be looking at things like gentle density in urban areas, 4 to 5 storey buildings, walkable communities. These are the kind of places people want to live. But it is going to involve, I'm afraid, ignoring some people who don't want to build on the green belt, whether or not they're people on the left, whether or not they're people on the right. Sometimes we will just have to say we're building this in the national interest and you're going to have to put up with it.
Well, Richard, do you accept that? You'll just have to be ignored.
No, we're not. No, Joe, we're not building it in the national interest. We've got hundreds of thousands of buildings like old shops, banks, etc., in town centres that we've got living accommodation before. In the 30s, 40s and 50s, it was used as houses. What we're doing is the national interest. It's not the national interest, it's the national builders' interest. That's what the government is working to.
It's
That's
in my interest. It's in my interest. It may not be in your interest, but it's certainly in my interest. And I will also say say...
No,
I will. I'll let you come back. Hang on, Richard. I'll let you
Just
come
make
back in a moment.
There's been this policy that we've had since 1997 of not building enough homes at the same time as increasing immigration from the low hundreds of thousands to almost 1 million in the most recent immigration figures. And now we're wondering why we have a housing crisis. We've increased the population by millions and then not built houses at the same time. That's a plague on both Labour and the Tories' houses.
Richard?
But again, like the supermarkets, we're letting the biggest builders control the councils. So here in Cheshire East, the council roll over and do whatever the builders want to do. And actually, what the council should be saying is, yes, we've got sites, folks, so these brownfield sites, these are the ones you can use first because there's roads there, there's schools there, etc. And then, once those are used up, you can then start ploughing into the greenfield. But the only people that benefit from building on greenfields are the builders and their shareholders. That is a proven fact.
Do you accept that?
I just think that we always move the goalposts. So, when we talk about the greenbelt, I think, if we want more infrastructure, that's normally a reason why, people like Richard opposes these sort of things. But if you want to put a school on a greenbelt site, they'll find a reason why you can't put it there. They'll say there's protected newts or something like that, something ridiculous.
Correct.
One thing I would love to see from Labour, though, a big issue that we have, you'll have a brand new building created that's affordable homes. A landlord will be able to go in, purchase the entire building and then put it onto the rental market. There needs to be some kind of legislation that says when affordable homes are built, they must go to first-time buyers.
Correct.
Well,
Correct.
Oh, right. Well, Richard agrees with that.
I mean, I'd like to see affordable homes go to first-time buyers or people who can't buy their own home. In my borough in Merton, we have 620 families currently in temporary accommodation. It's probably the lowest in London, but to us, it is enormous. That we've never been in this position before, and it won't be long before even big London boroughs fall over because of the amount of money they're spending on temporary accommodation. Awful properties at high cost to the taxpayer. It doesn't make any sense to carry this on.
Richard?
So when I'm going to London, I go to London for work every month. There's lots and lots of shops that have got buildings above, which you can clearly see they're empty. So why aren't the London boroughs turning those properties into homes like they used to be?
I think they have been for a very long time, Richard. When I had a proper job before I became an MP, my job was developing flats above shops for homeless families.
Well, you maybe should go back to that, Siobhan. It sounds like there's a need.
Are you suggesting I'm
No. It was a little joke.
Yeah, I mean, the trouble is, Richard is right. We should be building more in town centre because that's the only way we're going to make our town centres
But this government
thrive.
has actually sort of flipped this on its head.
It's not either or. We need the greenbelt, we need space above shops, we need closed down banks. This has to be, for me, the primary mission of any government, to build more homes, because we are sowing such seeds of social problems and future cost if we don't.
Bradley?
Well, I think all of the points that Richard makes are ones that I would fundamentally agree with. We do need more housing, but there is a golden opportunity in our urban areas, so towns and cities, particularly if we're keen on promoting sort of new vitality in town centres. But there's another crucial point. The government have abandoned a commitment to seeing beautiful homes being designed. And there are so many areas around the country which have seen housing growth in recent years. It's not designed aesthetically to a great standard. It's identikit stuff. If we can focus on quality, that really does help soften the argument and make it much easier for communities to accept housing.
Is Bradley right?
I think Bradley is right, and I actually wonder why the state doesn't take a more active approach in housing. I know that might be an odd thing for me to say, but actually I think we should be building more council homes, and I think the state should take out debt to build those council homes, because as a financial analyst, I cannot understand how a government taking out debt to build homes which are assets and then paying down that debt with the rentals from the tenants would not possibly be seen as a good investment for either a private credit investor or a state wanting to build more homes. So why isn't Labour announcing a mass state house building programme akin to what we saw in the mid-20th century?
Because we are here 40 years in to a policy of Mrs Thatcher, which was to take the subsidy away from bricks and mortars and building things and giving them to individuals in the form of housing benefit.
But we know the problem, we know the
and
diagnosis,
what we now
but that
have
is a solution.
huge crisis. So yes, I would like to see councils building. I'd like to see housing associations building. And I think we are getting to that point.
End right to buy?
No, I wouldn't be in favour of ending right to buy.
But you've just blamed that policy for taking out all that council stock.
I didn't blame right to buy. I don't believe that it was the council tenants of the past who are responsible of the homelessness of today. I'm saying what's the problem is the housing model where you stopped investing in building houses. If you built houses to replace the right to buy properties, everybody would be OK now. But we chose as a country, and the Conservatives chose as a government not to do that.
And it was very successful. And it was very successful, of course, at the time for the people who supported it. Richard, final word to you.
Sure. I think the key word's infrastructure. So again, here in Macclesfield, we've got £4,250 coming in the infrastructure into the local plan. The bus routes have been cancelled. The houses have been put in the wrong places, so people can't walk into town. They're miles away from town. The schools around and about. Figures were fudged to get the planning applications through. So we need infrastructure is the key thing. Don't start the greenbelt till you've started using up the brown belt.
Richard Slater, thank you very much for joining us. Now, you can listen to Politics Live if you're out and about on the live news stream on BBC Sounds. Just go to the live dial at the top of the BBC Sounds homepage and tap on live news. Please do try it if you can't catch the programme live. Let's go into the chamber because we've got Prime Minister's questions coming up in just under 10 minutes' time. It's looking pretty full with 8 minutes to go. Of course, Kemi Badenoch, Leader of the Opposition, will be asking the Prime Minister her set of questions. But I just want to bring up something else that has happened with the leader of the Conservative Party. Let's have a listen to this from Kemi Badenoch's Conservative Party conference speech back in October.
I was born here, but I grew up in a place where fear was everywhere. You cannot understand it unless you've lived it. Triple checking that all the doors and windows are locked, waking up in the night at every sound, listening as you hear your neighbours scream as they are being burgled and beaten, and wondering if your home will be next.
Kemi Badenoch, of course, grew up in Nigeria. She's criticised her experiences there or what happened to her in the country a few times. But now Nigeria has hit back in the form of the Vice President. Let's have a look at the Financial Times headline. Nigeria's Vice President launches attack on Tory leader Kemi Badenoch. Kashim Shettima's comments follow criticism by the Conservative leader of the country where she grew up. What do you make of this diplomatic row, if you like?
It's not a very good look for Kemi Badenoch, I would say. But ultimately, when politicians make comments like this, it's always for their own political capital. And I would say the comments of the Nigerian Vice President very much buy into something which is happening in the Nigerian media, where there are lots of media figures who attack Kemi Badenoch. And so the Nigerian Vice President has seen that and has decided he wants to cash in on that anger for the way that she's speaking about the country that she grew up in after she was born in England. But at the same time, you never saw Priti Patel or Rishi Sunak talk about India in the way that Kemi Badenoch talks about Nigeria. And I would simply say, if you are a Brexiteer and you're saying we need to be expanding our global trade beyond the European Union, we want to be looking at emerging markets for growth, fastest growing markets, don't slag off one of the fastest growing economies in Africa with one of the youngest populations that you have a personal link to. I mean, the Nigerian Vice President told her to change her name. That's embarrassing. Imagine how her family must feel about that. So I think she just needs to be a little bit more careful with her language. I think she can make the points that she makes about growing up in Nigeria without upsetting one of the biggest economies in Africa at the same time.
I mean, I suppose she might say, well, that was my experience. I'm just telling the truth as to how I saw it. I mean, she has actually hit back herself. This is from Lucy Fisher, the journalist. Kemi Badenoch hits back following criticism from Nigeria's Vice President. Kashim Shettima accuses her of denigrating her nation of origin. She was born here but grew up there and suggests she could change her name, as you've said. And her special advisor hits back. Kemi is not interested in doing Nigeria's PR. She is the leader of the opposition in the UK.
But, Joe, I know people who lived in Nigeria in similar areas to Kemi Badenoch and went to similar schools to Kemi Badenoch who talk about a very different experience. I'm not saying those things did not happen to Kemi Badenoch, but the simple fact of the matter is there are other Nigerians, British Nigerians, even people within the Conservative Party who have said these things to me, who have been upset with her approach towards Nigeria. And I think she just needs to be careful not to be too critical, because you never saw British Indian senior Conservative politicians talking about India, similar countries, by the way, in that sort of way. You never heard Narendra Modi saying that about Priti Patel or Rishi Sunak. So why is the Vice President of Nigeria saying this about Kemi Badenoch?
What do you make of this in terms of Kemi Badenoch?
Well, look, Kemi has spoken about her experiences from when she grew up in Nigeria, which was several decades ago. I'm sure that Nigeria today is not the country that it was back then, but Kemi is also known for her very forthright style. Yes. She says it as it is. She's quite an honest politician. She's refreshing in that sense. And as she said, she's getting on with her job as leader of the opposition.
But should she be more diplomatic? I mean, it has caused something of a row here.
I think Kemi was elected as leader of the party in part because, she's got a very forthright style. She has spoken about this from her childhood, which was several decades ago. She is focusing on her job, holding this disastrous government to account.
Yes, but also, at the same time, surely, Bradley, we can agree, it must be pretty embarrassing for the Vice President of your parents' country of origin to tell you to change your name. Like, this is not good PR for Kemi Badenoch, let alone Kemi Badenoch doesn't want to do PR for Nigeria, but she should want to do PR for herself. And this isn't good PR for Kemi Badenoch, in my opinion.
Or is it, Ava, as you said earlier, Albie, a little bit of political spin even for the Vice President of Nigeria?
Well, I don't know. I think it would suggest that perhaps Kemi Badenoch's personality isn't quite suited to being leader of the opposition because, if she's someone who can sort of begin, or fuel a diplomatic row at whim and then not be too bothered about it. I mean, her response from her spokesperson is almost like a Teflon response. It's like, well, I said what I said and I don't really care. That's not really the way to conduct diplomatic negotiations, is it? Or relationships.
But again, Kemi, she's got this very forthright style. And she spoke about this. It was decades ago when she lived and grew up in Nigeria. Kemi's combative style is what we need to hold this government to account, and that is the job.
It's a Nigerian style. It's a Nigerian style. That's the thing. Well, they are very forthright.
Another group of people who are holding the government to account are outside these studios, not just outside, but in Westminster, and that's farmers. It's not going away, is it, Siobhan? We can see here the pictures. The second time in a matter of weeks that farmers have descended on Westminster calling for changes to the inheritance tax that were brought in terms of farm estates in the budget. Should there be a rethink?
No, I don't think so. I don't think farmers and large farmers should be exempt to inheritance tax because nobody else is.
Yes, but are you sure it is only large farmers? We've had big discussions about whether it is actually going to hit the more medium-sized and smaller family farm.
Well, I think it's farms over 3 million, isn't it, if you have a married couple who owns
1.5 if you're single.
1.5 if you're single, 3 million if you're married. If you choose to pass on your farm 7 years prior to your death, then you escape inheritance.
Well, so should farmers just get planning?
I think the rules that exist for people who own their own homes should. It's perfectly fair for farmers to be in the same situation.
But they're cash poor, so they're not earning a living in the way that,
Can I
an
just
asset
tell
like
you,
a house is.
I tell you, I come from a country or my family come from a country where there are lots of farmers. Quite hard to find a poor farmer.
I mean, look, I think Siobhan's comments are frankly insulting to the whole of the farming community, and the government talk about food security being national security. We've seen that the government haven't even been able to internally agree on what the figures are. The Treasury is very different to DEFRA. This is not going away because this is an attack on anyone who owns property. Generates wealth for the economy. This doesn't potentially just stop at farmers. This is Labour showing their true colours, ideologically pursuing one particular group, and it's backfiring.
Well, because you just said you don't know any poor farmers, or you don't think there are very many poor farmers.
This is Labour trying to fill the black hole that they were left with for 22 billion. So who is it? Who is it? Who is it? Where do you get the money from? If somebody can find
how about reforming public services so that the government cuts its
have a leg to
profit
stand
pool?
on, because what you did to the farmers during your administration was absolutely shocking. And I've been out there all morning before I came to the studio speaking to farmers, and they lament the red tape.
We did not have farmers protesting in Westminster.
Yes, you did.
Not like
yes,
this.
you did.
Not like
I
this.
covered it.
Not on this scale.
There were 150 tractors here just 6 months ago. You're not going to sit here and lie. I covered it.
We can have a battle on the number of tractors that came in. There were protests, by the way, but these are continuing. You say it's only going to raise £500 million. But isn't it the case that nobody likes their taxes going up or tax changes? It is very difficult to do that, whoever is targeted.
Of course it is. Of course it's difficult. I mean, I don't like taxes going up either. I'm, in fact, very much anti-tax rises. I think we should scrap inheritance tax altogether. I think we've got to look at ways to reduce the size of the state. I know you always ask Conservatives how. I'll tell you how. We could do things like scrapping the winter fuel allowance for wealthy pensioners, for example. No one liked the sound of that. Means testing other pensioner benefits that people get, looking at worklessness and getting people back into work, reducing the benefits bill, efficiency savings, cutting international aid budgets.
Can you save that much money, though, from efficiency savings?
I didn't just say efficiency
savings.
No,
but can you save much money from that?
Yes, well, you can potentially save 5%. This is what we're hearing from the Labour government at the moment.
Perhaps?
Which is I don't want taxes to rise. I am in favour of streamlining the size of the state. I've just given a whole list of items that we could streamline, but unfortunately, the Conservatives aren't actually interested in streamlining the state. Neither are Reform, by the way, because when you ask them what do they want to streamline, they say things like quangos, and that's just a couple of £100 million.
Let's go to Prime Minister's questions.
Prime Minister. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I start by welcoming the fall of Assad? The people of Syria suffered for far too long under his brutal regime. Mr. Speaker, what comes next is far from certain. We've been talking to regional and global allies to ensure that it is a political solution that protects civilians and minorities and absolutely rejects terrorism and violence. Mr. Speaker, this morning I had meetings with ministerial colleagues and others. In addition to my duties in this House, I shall have further such meetings later on today.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. May I associate myself with the remarks of the Prime Minister in welcoming the fall of Assad and the hope now for the Syrian people. Mr. Speaker, since it returned to Labour control under Mayor Chris Cook, Middlesbrough Council has not only been taken out of government intervention in terms of children's services and a best value notice, but is also on track to becoming financially stable. I know the Prime Minister will want to join me in congratulating Mayor Cook and the Council on its recent successes. But after 14 years of Conservative austerity, can the Prime Minister confirm that the spending review will not simply end, but will unwind austerity and provide the resources councils need to properly serve our communities?
Prime Minister. Well, I join him in paying tribute to the Mayor and all local representatives across the country who do a fantastic job even when funding was cut to the bone under the last 14 years of the Tory government. Mr. Speaker, we're boosting local government funding by £4 billion, investing £1.6 billion to improve roads. And I was proud to see the work on the carbon capture cluster in Teesside, which will create 2,000 new jobs.
Leader of the Opposition, Kemi Badenoch.
Mr. Speaker, last week the Prime Minister didn't seem to want to talk about appointing fraudsters to his cabinet. In fact, he seemed to want to talk about immigration. So let's talk about immigration. He has relaunched yet again. Many new targets, 6 milestones, 5 missions. But why was cutting immigration not a priority?
Speaker, I'm glad she now wants to talk about immigration. Last week she said she didn't, and for good reason. Because the previous government presided over record high levels of immigration. The figures just a few weeks ago, nearly 1 million on net migration. That is unprecedented. A one-nation experiment in open borders under the last government. And she was the champion. She stood up and praised the then Tory Home Secretary for listening to her on removing caps on migration visas. So she was applauding it. Now she's furious about what she was campaigning for. We will drive it down. We will drive down lawful migration. We'll drive down illegal migration.
Mr. Speaker, he talks about open borders. He was the one campaigning for free movement. I was in this House asking for a lift on skilled migration. He was there supporting all of the people who should not have been in this country. He wanted us to relax immigration. But as he's so keen to talk about the past, let's look at his record. 4 years ago, the Prime Minister signed a letter demanding that foreign criminals be allowed to stay in Britain. Dozens of Labour and Liberal Democrat MPs repeatedly signed these letters insisting that rapists and murderers be allowed to stay here. One of those criminals, Ernesto Elliott, had 17 convictions, including for knife crime. After his deportation was blocked, Elliott went on to murder someone. He was able to stay here and murder because people like this man campaigned against deporting criminals. Will he apologise for signing these letters?
Mr. Speaker, I'd firstly remind her that when we're in the number now, under their watch, of migrants coming to this country, nearly 1 million, is over 4 times the number when we're in the EU. They lost control of the borders. And the particular example she puts to me is an example of failure under her government to take the necessary measures to keep our country safe.
Mr. Speaker, this is a ludicrous assertion. He is the one who was repeatedly signing letters. He even asked us to pause all deportations. He doesn't want to talk about his past, Mr. Speaker, but that letter is just the tip of the iceberg. There is more. The Prime Minister actually complained that the immigration system was working to deter migrants rather than provide support. He said, and I quote, that he was proud to have served as Jeremy's shadow immigration minister. He boasted that he took the last Labour government to court for cutting benefits for asylum seekers. He said he would never set a target-based approach to immigration. He wants to talk about immigration. Let's talk about his record. We can talk about it all day. I have committed... Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister says he wants to talk about immigration. I have committed to a cap on migration. Why won't he?
Mr. Speaker, she talks about my record. For 5 years, I was the chief prosecutor, prosecuting people who went to prison, many of whom were then deported. So while she's talking, I was actually doing the hard yards of convicting those that should be in prison. And she presided over record numbers of asylum seekers in this country, a record number of lawful and irregular migrants. That is 14 years when they lost control of the borders. They set a cap for each of those 14 years. It wasn't hard. It didn't stop people coming, and it got a record number. They should apologise for what they've done with their open borders policy.
Mr. Speaker, he did not answer a single...
Do you want to leave? If you've not got the guts to stand up to the comments, you shouldn't be in here. Let me bear up.
Mr. Speaker, he did not answer a single question. He never answers questions. He wants to talk about the past. The fact is, we've acknowledged where things went wrong. He will never take responsibility. He will never take responsibility. The fact is, he has scrapped a deterrent that the National Crime Agency has said we need. Since he came into government and scrapped the Rwanda deterrent, small boat arrivals have increased by nearly 20%. His own MPs are complaining about having to house asylum seekers. So can the Prime Minister tell the House how much more his government will spend on hotel accommodation because he scrapped the deterrent?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I'd invite her to tell us what went wrong under the last government, but it'd take us all afternoon. Mr. Speaker, we are going to smash the gangs that are running this vile trade. We signed a landmark agreement with Germany this week.
Order. Mr. Philp, you've been very loud. I think now we're going to have a little bit of silence from you, Prime Minister.
This week we signed a landmark agreement with Germany. She should be welcoming that, because that will make sure we have the powers to take enforcement action across the continent where it is needed. We've set up the Border Security Command. We've committed £75 million on top of the existing £75 million. We're extending the powers, so they're counter-terrorism-like powers. We've retained 9,400 people who shouldn't be here. A record flight got off. They talk about getting the flights off. They did it for years. They didn't succeed. We got the flights off.
Mr. Speaker, he says he wants to smash the gangs. The only thing he's smashed is his own reputation. The fact is, what he has been agreeing is not going to do anything. The cost of the Iraq agreement is £500,000. That wouldn't even buy a house in his constituency. Many of the things he's taking credit for are our agreements. Let's talk about what he put in his manifesto. The Prime Minister promised to end asylum hotels. He promised, he's the Prime Minister now, he promised, but in Altrincham and Peterborough, his government is expanding the use of asylum hotels because he unilaterally disarmed the deterrent. In fact, Mr. Speaker, a man who arrived by small boat told Sky News he was happy Labour were in power. That man said the Conservatives, and I quote, wanted to deport us, but Labour are making the procedure easier for us. He's right, isn't he?
Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, I really thought she should welcome the Iraq deal. Anybody who wants to deal with this vile trade would have welcomed it. She should also welcome the German deal that we did this week. Many of the boats that are finding their way to the Channel are coming through Germany. That is well documented. There's been a difficulty in taking enforcement action, which if she spent more time researching that than her terrible jokes, she would know about. And we have signed an agreement to smash and take enforcement action in Germany to stop those boats getting to the coast. That is effective action. She should welcome it. It's really good news. All law enforcement think it's a good thing. Why does she think it's a bad thing?
Because the numbers are going up, Mr. Speaker, under his watch. The Prime Minister has consistently backed criminals over law-abiding British people. He defended terrorists like Hizb ut-Tahrir in the European Court. He argued all immigration law had a racist undercurrent. He voted against life sentences for people smugglers. He voted against more than 100 measures to control migration. He even said it was wrong. He even said, Mr. Speaker, that it was wrong when the Conservatives took away Shamima Begum's citizenship. Now he has appointed her defence lawyer as his Attorney General. Mr. Speaker, events in Syria mean we may see more small boat arrivals. For once, will he take the side of the British people and strip citizenship from jihadi terrorists and supporters of Assad who want to come back and destroy this country?
Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, I was Director of Public Prosecution for 5 years. Unlike anyone on their benches, I was prosecuting for 5 years hundreds of thousands of criminals. That includes huge terrorist gangs, rapists. I was working for 3 of those 5 years with the then Home Secretary Theresa May, who commended the work that I did at the end of those 5 years. So for her to stand there and say, I haven't done anything in law enforcement, I dedicated 5 years of my life to law enforcement, locking up criminals, which is more than she can say. And it would be easier to take the opposition seriously if they actually got serious. Not a slither of remorse, not a hint of contrition. It's like the arsonist complaining about the people who are trying to put the fire out. And all they do is come every week with more and more complaints. Just wait till they get their hands on the people that created the mess that we are clearing up. We're fixing the economy, we're ending their open borders policy, we're taking down the waiting list. That's what people voted for. We're delivering it.
No law. Mr. Speaker, since in the last couple of months, since I spoke to the Prime Minister here about the need for social and industrial investment in Cornwall, we've had a fresh tranche of shared prosperity funding, a huge boost to international interest in our most cleanest energy industries, and we've had a roadmap to greater political autonomy that reflects Cornwall's unique national identity. Will the PM join his minister on that visit in the spring to meet with the industry firsthand and spell out a roadmap for Cornwall to helping Britain become a clean energy superpower?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I thank my honourable friend. He's a champion of the extraordinary potential of Cornwall, particularly in our transition to clean power by 2030. Next week we'll publish our English devolution white paper, setting out our ambitions to move power from Westminster into every part of England, including Cornwall. And I know he and his colleagues are meeting the Deputy Prime Minister to discuss this next week.
Leader of the Liberal Democrats, Sir Ed Davey.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. While Syrians are rejoicing at the overthrow of the brutal Assad regime, many people there and around the world are worried about what comes next, as the Prime Minister indeed said, with the threats of extremism, ISIS terrorism and unsecured chemical weapons. Only an open political process can bring peace and stability, but that will require the full backing of the international community. So does the Prime Minister share my concern that President-elect Trump said about Syria, and I quote, "The United States should have nothing to do with it"? If America walks away and steps away, will he step up and work with other allies to provide British leadership over Syria?
Prime Minister.
He's right to say this is a very serious moment. We all welcome the fall of Assad. I hope this can be a turning point for Syria, a much-needed turning point, but that is by no means guaranteed, and that is why we've been speaking intently and intensely with our allies in the region across the globe about how we ensure that this is peaceful, it is political, and it's a rejection of terrorism and violence. This could be a turning point, but in the past we've always thought that what comes next is necessarily better. That hasn't turned out to be the case, and that's why we're working so hard on this and showing the leadership that he and the House would expect from this government.
Sir Ed Davey.
Can I thank the Prime Minister for that reply, and I hope we can continue to work on a cross-party basis to do Britain's role in securing peace and stability in the Middle East. But moving on to another subject, Mr. Speaker, British farmers are the best in the world. Yeah. They are the best in the world because of our tradition of family farms, where from generation to generation a commitment to high-quality food, to our precious environment, animal welfare, is passed down. But family farms were let down badly by the last Conservative government, with their botched transition to new payment schemes and their unfair trade deals with Australia and New Zealand that have undercut British farmers. Now, many family farms feel the government's budget will be the final blow. So will the Prime Minister change course and recognise the vital role that British family farms play?
Yeah. Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, as he knows, we put £5 billion into farming over the next 2 years. That's a record number under the budget. Last week alone, £350 million to support farmers in the United Kingdom. That does contrast with the last government, who was an underspend of £300 million in relation to farmers. In relation to inheritance tax, as he knows, in a typical family case, the threshold is £3 million, and therefore the vast majority of farmers will be unaffected, despite the fear-mongering of the party opposite.
Bill Brittle.
Speaker, places of worship are vitally important, not just for practising one's faith, but also for local heritage. The government's Places of Worship grant scheme currently provides much-needed tax relief for religious buildings in need of renovation, but is scheduled to end next year. What assurances can the Prime Minister provide my constituents that the government will continue to support restoring our much-cherished places of worship, such as Holy Trinity Church in Horwich?
Prime Minister.
I thank you for that question and recognise the important roles that these buildings play at the heart of communities, particularly, Mr. Speaker, at a time like Christmas. There are a wide range of funds available for maintenance and restoration, including the National Lottery Heritage Fund's Places of Worship scheme. Details will be confirmed in the usual way by departments at the spending review.
Hannah.
Mr. Speaker, last week my neighbours Omar and Delma Al-Shishkaki, who serve South Belfast as a doctor and a classroom assistant, received the news that they have been dreading. Dalal's mother and brother were among 23 Gazans killed in their tent by an Israeli airstrike in the so-called humanitarian zone of Al-Mawasi, and other family members are fighting for their lives in a barely functioning health system. Prime Minister, the crisis in Gaza is getting worse and not better. None of us in this chamber can end their nightmare, but we can do more. This government have rightly used every tool at their disposal, sanctions on arms and trade and officials against Putin's Russia. When will Israel be held to the same standards for genocide? When will this government confirm further sanctions, recognise the state of Palestine and offer some hope to beleaguered Gazans and many millions who are watching on in horror?
Prime Minister.
Can I start by saying I'm sorry to hear of the dreadful loss of the families of her constituents. There have been far too many examples like that. I was pleased to see that there's now a ceasefire in Lebanon. We desperately need that now in Gaza, something we've been pressing for some time. There's intense talks going on to that end at the moment, as she knows. That would provide the space for the hostages to be allowed out. They've been there for a very, very long time. Desperately needed aid to go in at speed and at scale, but also opens the potential for the pathway to the two-state solution, which I believe is the only peaceful way to resolve this ongoing conflict.
Katrina Murray.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My constituents in the east of Kirkintilly are experiencing a housing emergency. Not enough houses for families or for those fleeing domestic abuse, and what houses there are in drastic need of repair. Does the Prime Minister agree with me that the Scottish Government should be prioritising repairing this housing emergency, but also the funding of local authorities to address this crisis of their own making?
Prime Minister.
Well, I'm grateful to her for raising this, because in Scotland, house building has ground to a halt. Homelessness is at record numbers. Children in temporary accommodation, record numbers. And that this budget was the biggest settlement for Scotland since devolution. So they've got the powers, they've got the money. What they haven't got is any more excuses.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The people of Thornbury have been promised a new health facility for more than 20 years, but have seen every proposal fall by the wayside. That's why it was a great relief to residents when the Health Minister confirmed to me in writing that the funding to rebuild the centre would be made available. However, we are still months away from seeing the final plans signed off, never mind having spades in the ground. So what reassurances can the Prime Minister give me and my constituents that this isn't just another hollow promise, and that the proposals will be approved swiftly once they hit the Health Secretary's desk?
Well, I'm grateful to her for raising that, and it's obviously a cause of concern for her constituents. And we are determined to fix the broken NHS that we inherited from the party opposite. We've set out our targets in the plan for change last week. As she knows, the Department for Health, NHS England and the Local Care Board are working together to deliver for patients in her constituency. It is important, as she'll appreciate, that we go through the proper business case as part of this rebuild. But what I can make sure is she gets a meeting with the relevant minister to be updated on behalf of her constituents.
Peter Lamb.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Following years of real terms cuts to their funding, St Catherine's Hospice, serving my constituency of Crawley, has recently made a number of redundancies. Palliative care is hugely important to our communities, and I pay tribute to them for their work. Can the Prime Minister join me in thanking the work of St Catherine's and outline how the Government will look to support palliative care moving forwards?
Prime Minister.
I will join him in that and recognise the vital role that hospices play in providing support to people at the end of their life and understand the challenges that they face. Most hospices receive funding by providing NHS services, and funding will be set out in the usual way. Thank you.
Jerome Mayu.
Mr Speaker, losing a farm is not like losing any other business. It can't come back. Now, those are the words of the Prime Minister, those that he said to the NFU in order to get their votes. So can the Prime Minister understand why farmers in Broadland and Falkland and around the country now think that his administration is duplicitous?
Mr Speaker, I think everybody welcomes the £5 billion over the next 2 years that we put in the budget to... Well, they shake their heads, I'm afraid they do. £350 million in the last week alone, compared with the £300 million underspend by the last government. On the threshold, as he well knows, in an ordinary family case, the threshold is £3 million, and that means the vast majority of farmers will be unaffected.
Joyce Dewberry.
14 years of the party opposite gutting local government has left councils having to make My constituents were recently shocked when Cannock Chase District Council proposed the closure of the Museum of Cannock Chase and the Prince of Wales Theatre. Can the Prime Minister ask the Culture Minister to please, and his officials to please meet with me to see what can be done to save our museum and theatre?
Mr. Speaker, they groan at the question. The Leader of the Opposition was saying they're coming to terms with their failures. Well, they're obviously struggling just a bit. I understand it's been a huge loss to his constituency. Councils across the country were at the front line of the last government's ruinous economic failure. We announced £4 billion in additional funding for local government, a real terms increase in core spending power. We will continue to do so, and I will make sure that he gets a meeting with the relevant minister.
Chris Law.
These last months have shown that cruel Westminster governments of whichever party continue to target the weakest in society, while the Scottish Government will continue to protect them. Whilst the Labour Party have voted to continue the two-child benefit cap from the Conservatives, the SNP are abolishing it. While the Prime Minister picks the pockets of pensioners of their winter fuel allowance, Scotland's First Minister, John Swinney, has reinstated it. So, Mr. Speaker, given support for Labour is plummeting, and support for Scottish independence is once again leading in the polls, who does the Prime Minister believe makes the best decisions for Scotland?
Prime Minister.
Those that were elected in a general election on the 4th of July, they're sitting here.
In centuries past, the three rivers that converge on the centre of Carlisle have made the city highly defendable against invading armies. However, in 1985, 2005 and 2015, those same rivers overpowered the city, leaving thousands devastated by flooding. What assurances can the Prime Minister give my constituents that the flood defences that the Conservatives promised but failed to deliver will be completed under this government?
Can I start by wishing her a happy birthday? She raises a really important matter for her constituents who faced appalling flooding too many times, and the last government left our defences in a state of absolute disrepair. Mr. Speaker, we're investing £2.4 million this year, and the Environment Agency are currently studying options to improve protection in Carlisle. I'll make sure she gets a meeting to discuss the specific options.
Becca Paul.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In recent weeks, the former head of MI6, Sir Richard Dearlove, has warned that conflict between Russia and the West is no longer coming, it has already come. With Russia poised to spend more than 6% of its GDP on its military next year, the time for reviews and roadmaps is over. Will the Prime Minister recognise the urgency of the situation and commit to spending at least 2.5% of GDP on defence without further delay?
Well, Mr. Speaker, she's right about the importance of national security, particularly at the moment. At the budget, we delivered £2.9 billion increase in the MOD budget. We're pleased to deliver the largest pay rise for our armed forces in 22 years, and we'll set out the path to 2.5 in due course. That target, of course, was last met under the last Labour government. It wasn't met once in the 14 years that they were in power.
Right, McNally.
Mr. Speaker, in October 2023, my constituent Mark Somerville received the shattering news that at 43 he had motor neuron disease. Since then, he has set up the Mark Somerville Foundation and is doing incredible work to raise awareness of the condition. Mark is in the gallery today and will speak to MPs later about living with MND. Will my right honourable friend join me in recognising the work of Mark and his foundation and commit the government to doing all it possibly can to support efforts to find a cure for this devastating disease?
Well, I thank my honourable friend for raising this case. He mentioned it to me last night, and I do pay tribute to Mark, who's in the gallery, and the work of his foundation. This diagnosis can so obviously be absolutely devastating, and it's testament, if I may say so, to his bravery and compassion that he is raising awareness of the condition. I think many of us would question whether we're capable of doing what he's doing, given the diagnosis that he's had. Last week, of course, Mr. Speaker, I paid tribute to the inspirational Kevin Sinfield, another incredible champion. And I say to both of them, all those campaigning, we stand with you in this fight.
Yeah. Sir Ian Duncan-Smith.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, the Ron Cornelius has been detained in Dubai for 17 years. His property was seized in what is a very unjudicial process. The Prime Minister has been to UAE. I want to ask the Prime Minister whether, when he went there, did he now demand that Ron Cornelius was freed, given that the United Nations came to the conclusion that his detention was arbitrary and in violation of international law, and following that, would he now make Magnitsky sanctions deliverable on those who are responsible for this after he is released?
Prime Minister.
This is an important case, and of course it's been raised by the government a number of times, including by the Foreign Secretary as part of the trip that I was on. I myself raised human rights issues, but it is a serious case. We'll continue to press for the outcome that I know he and his family desperately want.
Sarah Owen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Stellantis could not have asked for more from the workers at the Luton plant. Like every generation of Vauxhall worker in Luton, they meet every target set. They make every innovation demanded of them. They never give up. Contrast this with Carlos Tavares, the CEO, who days after making the decision to threaten over 1,000 jobs in Luton, quit. Does the Prime Minister agree that in light of this sudden departure of the CEO, Stellantis should review this decision? Do what's right by our town, stay put for good, or until an alternative is found to ensure Luton's manufacturing history is also our future?
Prime Minister.
I thank you for raising it, which is it's obviously an issue of grave concern to her constituents, and the government is totally committed to supporting the workers and their families at this uncertain time, and the Industry Minister will meet the company this week to discuss plans for workers and the site to ensure that dedicated support is in place. We'll continue to do so because I know it's an issue of considerable concern to her constituents.
Joshua Reynolds.
Ben and Henry, otherwise known as the Ocean Oarsmen, will be rowing across the Atlantic next year for Alexander Devine Children's Hospice in Maidenhead, with a target of raising £50,000. This hospice, Thames Hospice and many others, though, are struggling with rising costs and the planned increase in employers' national insurance. So will the Prime Minister join with me in wishing Ben and Henry the best of luck on their journey and take this opportunity to scrap the NI rise for hospices?
Well, can I pay tribute to Ben and Henry and everybody supporting their campaign. It's obviously an important issue. The funding arrangements will be set out in due course.
For retail workers in Bolton North East, the busy Christmas season is overshadowed by shoplifting, which Usdall's latest survey identifies as the leading trigger of abuse, threats and assaults. At a police drop-in in Bromley Cross, officers welcomed this government's commitment to clamping down on low-level shoplifting and prosecuting repeat offenders. What more can the government do to tackle shoplifting and support retail workers and businesses during their critical holiday season?
Prime Minister.
Well, I thank you for raising this, and I've spoken to many who work in our shops who are very, very concerned about shoplifting, and because of the approach that was taken by the previous government, it went out of control. We are bringing it under control. It's not low level. It has a huge impact on other customers, has a particular impact on staff working in supermarkets, and that's why we are dedicating funding to training police and retailers and supporting specialist analyst teams to crack down on the gangs that are targeting retailers.
Paul Holmes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. In the last few weeks of the last government, we awarded millions of pounds to remote train stations like Hedge End and Swanwick in my constituency under the Accessibility for All scheme. In the first 2 weeks of this government, that was scrapped. Will the Prime Minister use his good offices to give my constituents and stations across this country an early Christmas present and give us our money back, please?
Prime Minister.
Well, I'm grateful for him. This is an important issue for his constituents. The problem is the last government made lots and lots of promises, but they never set aside the money to pay for them. That's why we picked up a £22 billion black hole. They made promises in relation to infected blood, promises in relation to Horizon. They didn't put aside the money to pay for it. We've had to inherit that, to clean it up. We will get on with delivery, but we had to balance the books and stabilise the economy first.
Lizzie Collins.
Mr Speaker, this past weekend one of my market towns, Kirkby Lonsdale, suffered a devastating fire, resulting in the loss of a local man's life. The whole town centre was closed and many local businesses have been affected. Sunday was meant to be a day of celebration with Christmas markets, family games and community events, and instead the town faced a tragedy. Can the Prime Minister tell me how the government can support communities like Kirkby Lonsdale to rebuild and recover after tragedies such as this?
Prime Minister.
I'm grateful to her for raising this awful situation, and I think all of us can only imagine the impact that this must have had on the town, on the families and the friends of the victims of this awful tragedy. And I commend the community, which has come together in an extraordinary way in the aftermath of this awful event. I'll make sure she has a meeting with the relevant minister to discuss how the government can support her community at this vital time.
Final question, Ellie Chance.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. This week I was contacted by my constituent Sally. She's a GP and she'd called 999 on Monday for a critically ill patient to try to get an ambulance, but couldn't because they were all stuck outside Hereford A&E waiting to unload their patients. At the same time, we know that across the country, medically fit patients are unable to be discharged because of the social care crisis. So can I ask the Prime Minister, what is he doing to fix social care, to fix patient flow through hospitals, so that ambulances can get back to saving lives?
Well, I'm grateful to her for raising this case, and it's awful, an example that is all too common because of the fact that the last government broke the NHS. And she'll have seen the Lord Darcy report that we published on the state of the... No, they should be utterly ashamed of themselves in relation to what they did to our NHS. But she raises a really important point. That's why we put a record amount into the NHS in the budget, £25 billion. We've set out in our priorities what we need to do with the NHS. We'll work at pace on this as hard as we possibly can. She's right to raise it. They should hang their heads in shame.
That completes Prime Minister's questions.
That is the end of Prime Minister's questions. Let me introduce our guests for this part of Politics Live. For the Government, the Science Minister, Chris Bryant, and for the Conservative, Shadow Science Minister, Dr Ben Spencer. Welcome to both of you, and my colleague Henry Zeffman, the BBC's chief political correspondent. You will have noticed, of course, that the majority of the questions from Kemi Badenoch to Sir Keir Starmer were broadly on immigration. It was curious that the Conservative leader decided to ask and question and accuse the Prime Minister on levels of immigration, net migration, because they presided over the record number of net migration, 906,000 in the year ending 2023, and never met the pledge to bring it down to tens of thousands. So what was the logic?
Not only never met it, but far exceeded it, especially in the last few years. I mean, it's not hard to imagine the strategic discussion that will have happened in Kemi Badenoch's team when they talked about what she might go on at this week's PMQs, or certainly the strategic discussion that ought to have happened. And, you know, there will have been people, I'd imagine, who would have said, hang on, our record on this is not quite as strong as we would like it to be. They will have anticipated that Keir Starmer will have come back as he did with his line of the moment, which is accusing the Conservatives of having unleashed a one-nation experiment in open borders. My hunch is that when I ask Conservative MPs privately later what they made of PMQs, I'm not sure they will think that it worked for Kemi Badenoch at this stage in the cycle when the Conservative government is so fresh to have led on immigration. Of course, there will come a time when what is paramount in the voters' minds and in the public's minds will be the Labour government's record in immigration, but it is still just a few months since they took over.
Will you be one of those MPs who will question the logic of that line of questioning from Kemi Badenoch?
No. So
For the election and before, what I've seen is that people are fed up with politicians who come across as saying what they think people want to hear and not putting having things on reality. I mean, it's quite self-evident that we haven't done anywhere near as well as we'd like to have done in terms of dealing with legal migration and illegal migration. We acknowledge that. That's the starting point. Now it's to say, well, actually, what's the plan in terms of fixing it? We had a plan. It was working. The Labour Party scrapped it.
Well, Chris.
They didn't have a plan and it wasn't working. They had a gimmick, which was Rwanda, cost £740 million, I think. Is that the right figure now, to deport 4 people who were deported voluntarily? Since the general election, we have transformed some of the bits as fast as we possibly can, both in terms of legal and illegal migration. The number of enforced returns is up by 19% since the Labour Party came to power. The number of illegal working visits is up by 34%. The number of arrests following those is up by 25%. But look, the truth of the matter is, when it got to the general election, not only did we have... Well, people thought it was one figure, and it turns out it was much higher level of net migration to the UK, even than people were worried about. And on top of that, you had, I think I'm right in saying, this is from my memory, so Joe, you might have more accurate figures, but 120,000 people waiting to be dealt with in the asylum system, not even being processed at all. So, of course, we had a massive backlog that had to be dealt with. It wasn't being tackled. And we are getting on with the job of trying to sort it, because it really does matter. And what irritates me about Kemi Badenoch is her very selective use of statistics. She said the numbers of small boats are up this year. They are up on last year.
She was right about that.
However, the year that you really need to be looking at is 2022, when I think it was 45,744 people came on small boats.
Well, let me go back to you, Ben. Why would you highlight a catastrophic failure by successive Conservative governments on their own metrics? Why would you focus on that? Because we're now going to talk about it. Not only were there record net migration figures, but the pledge that Henry quite rightly said was never met, and not even close to it, has been in place since 2010. It's been in repeated Conservative manifestos. You cited it as probably the most important issue for voters, and you failed to deliver on it. Why would you focus on it?
So, migration, both illegal and legal migration.
Well, let's just talk about legal,
is incredibly important to people across the country.
Yeah.
It's an important issue. I think the problem is if you don't highlight it and you don't talk about it, then other people can try and make, it goes to different places. And people are very concerned that politicians aren't talking about migration. We're not having the transparency that we need around it.
You talked about it endlessly. This programme was full of discussions on immigration and migration, and the illegal immigration is part of the overall net migration figures, but only about 3%. We talked about it endlessly on this programme, and the fact that you didn't actually tackle it.
So we had a plan which was starting to work, but I think the counter I would say to you
we
is...
don't know. We don't know if Rwanda was going to work.
Would you rather that we didn't talk about it? Would you rather we say, no, we're not going to cover immigration, which is a hugely important political issue. We concede that things didn't go as well as we'd have liked to say at the very least.
But my question is, why focus on it now?
Because we've got the figures, and it's something that's very important. I mean, would you not expect the opposition to raise issues which are important to the public?
Well,
and bearing in mind that the plan, which was going to work, I believe Rwanda would have had an effect, a deterrent effect,
14 years.
has been literally ripped up. And what we see from the Labour Party
you
is...
can't possibly have supported the Rwanda scheme.
What we see from the Labour Party is we see headlines, but we don't see any plan behind it.
Well, a deterrent, of course, has been highlighted by people in border security and border control as something that would be effective. Do you think the Labour government has got a deterrent?
I think far more effective is first of all dealing with the gangs as close to the start as you possibly can. Secondly, the deal that we've done with Germany in the last few days, because we know that lots of the migration patterns...
It's not a silver bullet, is it? It's a technical change, but...
All right, but it's likely to lead to more prosecutions and with any luck, it's going to lead to ending some of that trade. But look, we've got to cooperate with our international allies rather than endlessly irritating them, because we know that it doesn't start at Calais. It starts a long way before Calais. if you're talking specifically about the small boats trade. I actually supported one thing that the government did last year in relation to being able to bring students being able to bring over their dependents,
yes.
because my experience in South Wales was that the local university was bringing lots of people from, because they could no longer bring people from Europe, they were bringing people from other parts of the world who all came with dependents. Most of them mature students,
yes.
and there was literally no accommodation for them. And we were fundraising to put, beds in people's accommodation. So I think that it was absolutely, that piece of the equation was absolutely right. But honestly, the idea that the Rwanda scheme was a genuine deterrent is absolute nonsense, and they knew it from the beginning.
Well, we don't know because it didn't actually come into play. Can I just ask you, Henry, about the letter that Kemi Badenoch referred to repeatedly, that Keir Starmer, she said, the Prime Minister, had signed, which would prevent foreign criminals being deported, and in fact they were then allowed to stay. What's the sort of veracity and the sort of context of that?
Well, the Conservatives have now given us more detail of what Kemi Badenoch was talking about there. She was talking about a letter that Keir Starmer released during his leadership campaign in early 2020. And of course, we know that he now stands by almost nothing that he said in that leadership campaign. In fact, one of his 10 pledges, which he has subsequently ditched, was, I think the words were, to defend free movement as the UK leaves the European Union. Now he, of course, does not support reintroducing free movement with the EU. In this letter, he talks a bit about that, says free movement has been hugely beneficial. He also argues for a more humane and effective international response to the refugee crisis. He says if he's elected Labour leader, I will start work immediately on plans for radical change in the immigration system, no more hostile environment, no more demonising of migrants, talks about ending indefinite detention, closing immigration detention centres. I mean, it goes on. It's a long letter. But I think you can see there why Kemi Badenoch thinks this is fertile territory for the Conservatives, notwithstanding their record. It is just a question about politically how she can manage that slightly difficult pivot from having been in the cabinet a few months ago to now attacking the new occupants of ministries of this government.
I mean, his beliefs, his assertions, Keir Starmer's then, as he was campaigning to be leader, they have changed in some regard. Now he is leader and Prime Minister. Is this a problem for you as a government in terms of wanting to go against a hostile environment but wanting to drive immigration down?
Well, I don't want to demonise migrants either. I don't think that's in anybody's interests. I also want an asylum system that works, that is properly compassionate to those who have a genuine claim under the law, laws that we've signed up to along with many other countries in the world. And for instance, when it came to Ukraine, of course, the British people opened their doors very warmly and generously because they knew that the people of Ukraine were fleeing a war situation. One of the things that really angered me, and of course, this is one of the things that changed between 2020 and now, is the number of people who were coming on small boats rose very dramatically, and then none of them were processed.
Yeah.
So they were sitting in hotels for months and months and months, not even being assessed by anybody in the Home Office because the government had patently failed in its singular job, which is to have a proper asylum system that works. And interestingly, it was exactly the same in 1997 when we came to power. The asylum system in the UK didn't work after 18 years of Conservative rule. And guess what? It didn't work after 14 years of Conservative rule either.
Ben, just very briefly, because Kemi Badenoch referred to the Prime Minister being in favour of freedom of movement when the UK was part of the EU. But the figures cited by the Prime Minister are correct, aren't they? That we now have almost 3 times as many people coming here under net migration figures than came when we were part of the EU and we had freedom of movement.
So I don't know if they're correct or not, so forgive me on that. But I'll take his and your word. Yeah, well, I'll take the word from that. It just, again, it shows how we've got to deal with our legal migration issue. We've got structural problems in the UK in the fact that our workforce, we have a very large workforce which is not in employment, which record levels of people who are on sickness, which is something that we've tried to reform. I think it's really important that we're talking about and grasping these issues. And I think one of the other reasons why Kemi brought it up today is because the Prime Minister's reset last week was notable by excluding it and not covering this issue, which was so important to so many of our constituents.
I mean, that was curious. Why wasn't it there, tackling immigration? He says he wants to drive it down.
Look, it's part of our 5 missions. One of the elements. No, OK. So I noted the cynicism.
Well, only because the 5 missions, the 6 pledges, the milestones. But if it's such a priority, why wasn't it in the recent one?
Well, it is a piece of work that we're working on. And look, there are loads of things that we're working on that that weren't mentioned last Thursday. Incidentally, I'm the Minister for Tourism. I don't want us to be using all our hotels in the UK for asylum seekers waiting for their claims to be assessed. I want them to be used for international tourists coming to the UK, which is why we set our target last year of getting to 50 million international visitors to the UK by 2030.
We're going to talk about something completely different, but extremely important. Let's have a look at this headline in The Times. Think you may be autistic? We can assess you in 2043. A charity working on behalf of the NHS says it can no longer cope with a surge in people seeking diagnosis. It's from Oxfordshire Adult Autism Diagnostic and Support Service run by Charity Autism at Kingwood. The charity told us that due to long waiting lists, it can take 18 years for those seeking a diagnosis to receive an assessment because of the need to clear the backlog. According to the Nuffield Trust, in 2023, waiting times for the first autism assessment was up to a year. Let's talk to Rowena Boyton, who has been on a waiting list, I think, for 3 years for an autism assessment. Tell us about your experience, Rowena.
Hi. So I've been on the list since April last year, and I didn't know that originally because my original assessment was lost. They didn't know where it had even gone, so I tried to track it down. And I had to phone around a bunch of different providers in the area to just to find out where my referral had gone. And I was told that it went to the single point of access and then it just stayed there and nobody dealt with it. So eventually, a friend of mine helped me contact PALS and I didn't hear anything back, but it did actually move. They did send me a letter and said, disregard everything that you've been told to now. It's still at the single point of access and we'll send you out some, I sent out like some paperwork to fill out.
And Rowena, how long have you been told you'll have to wait for an assessment?
They didn't actually 100% say, because they refused to be drawn into it when I asked. They told me to just check the website, and the website says it's 3 years.
Oh, I see. Why is it important for you to get diagnosed for autism?
Because I need to forgive myself for not being... Well, I feel like an alien that's trying to pretend to be human, like I've got an alien skin on a human person. And even when I was little, I was different. And kids knew I was different. So they treated me differently. Of course they did. And not positively. And I know that I would say and do things that weren't necessarily the correct social things. I struggled a lot socially. I used to go completely mute, like I couldn't talk to people. And it makes you a target. And I need to be able to look at myself and say, I forgive myself for not being the human being that was expected. And I need to be able to, it's kind of like a vindication as well that I'm not just a fundamentally broken human being, that I actually have something going on with me that made it that way, that made it very difficult for me.
Well, Rowena, that's very honest and open of you to talk like that. We have 2 politicians here in the studio. I'm going to come to you, Ben, because you are a former, I don't know if you're currently practising at all as a consultant psychiatrist. What do you say in response to listening to Rowena and a possible 3-year wait for an assessment?
Well, firstly, I say to Rowena directly, I'm sorry that, you're struggling so much at the moment, and that's the experience you've had both in terms of your symptoms and in terms of access to care and treatment. And I hope you get the right care and treatment that you need as soon as possible. On the specifics around autistic spectrum disorders, one thing that, and I speak very much as a politician, one thing nevertheless I found very interesting, which I don't really quite understand, is why there's been such an explosion of people needing referrals to assessments over the past few years and what's going on there. Now, I'm not the person to answer that question, but it's a question that I have in terms of what's happening there. And speaking to local schools, we've got a very good one in my constituency that's focused on speech and language delay, and they talk to me about the importance of early screening for speech delay, something that I've been raising with the government. My local mental health trust tells me that the assessment processes set up by NICE are very labour intensive, which means that it's very difficult for them to get sufficient numbers of staff to be able to process people quickly. And of course, we've got a workforce challenges when it comes to consultant psychiatrists.
But should we change our approach to neurodiversity more broadly? I mean, the Nuffield Trust Chief Executive, Thea Stein, says pumping more money into the current system wouldn't help. And it was frankly impossible to imagine how the system can grow fast enough to fulfil this demand. We're at a really critical point as a society where we're actually understanding neurodiversity and the fact that it's a much greater spectrum for the whole of society than we've ever had before. Chris?
Well, first of all, I mean, I'd say directly to Rowena, thanks very much for saying what you said, because I know that there will be thousands of people in the country for whom you are saying exactly what they have felt, if not tens of thousands, no doubt. And I've heard it from other people. Interestingly, I've done quite a lot of work over the years as an MP on acquired brain injury, which I know is very different, but it's part of the same neurodiversity spectrum. And for many people who've had acquired brain injuries, the moment that they learnt that it was the brain injury that led to some of the problems that they've had in terms of being able to relate to other people or exercise executive functions and so on, has been a moment of liberation. Now, to answer, Joe, your precise question, or maybe it's Ben's question really, actually, which is about why has this changed over the years? When I was first elected in 2001, interestingly, I had a lot of constituents coming to me saying, our child has received a diagnosis, but we can't get any place for the appropriate teaching for them in schools. But when I spoke to my colleagues in other areas of the country, they found it was the reverse. There were plenty of places, but nobody was getting any diagnoses. Right. And so I think this is a new, relatively new space for us as a work. What we need is a national strategy to get all of our waiting lists down. We need to believe in our NHS so that for the future there are more people wanting to work in the NHS. We have a chronic shortage in a whole series of different areas, including in this area.
Yes.
And I would argue you need specific national strategies on autism, which encompasses the work that we're doing around SEN, special educational needs in schools, which is why we've just set aside the best part of £1 billion for that.
But for Rowena, it's still going to be years possibly before she gets an assessment or a diagnosis. Is that acceptable?
Oh, clearly not. I mean, I think she also, I'm glad she's gone through powers. It sounds like she also needs to contact her MP because we have quite a few people, and it shouldn't be like that, but we have quite a few people who contact me if casework on that. I think the key is that she gets the needs and the assessment that she needs and the treatment and support she needs. I'm a bit nervous about everything being a national strategy, though, because I would argue, well, we should have a national schizophrenia strategy, we should have a national dementia strategy, we should have a national autism strategy, and eventually you get to the point where you have a national strategy of everything. I think getting.
Well, you need a national strategy for the NHS. Is the single most, because we need to get all.
I look forward to hearing yours when it eventually comes.
Which will
out.
arrive soon. We've indeed. There's just one other point about Rowena's.
Briefly, because I want to go back to Rowena.
It is disgraceful that your paperwork, or if it was paperwork, that it was paperwork in the first place, rather than a digital system so that everybody could easily access your records, in the medical system. But secondly, appalling that it got lost in the system. And that's one of the things that we've radically got to change about the whole of the NHS. And that requires a degree of reform. So it's not just pumping money in, it's also reform.
But do you have any faith, Rowena, that things are going to be radically different for you and other people seeking a diagnosis under this government than under previous governments?
I feel like the entire system in itself needs to change. I feel like there needs to be an accountable person who can look at the mental health system as a whole, because the waiting list, it's not just autism. I mean, it's the whole of the mental health sort of system. If you change that process from the top up, then at the moment it's very much of a tick box, screen you out because there's no one to see you, essentially, which means people fall through the cracks, which also means that's less people who have got support. And with the right support, people can be, living fulfilling lives. They're getting a job and things like that. That there are barriers at the moment. Only 22% of autistic people are actually in work, going by the Office of National Statistics, and that is in part due to the fact that it's really hard to get any support at all. without a diagnosis. And the diagnosis system is just broken from the top. It's also really skewed towards boys. Girls fall through the cracks massively. My daughter had the same. She was finally diagnosed, but she didn't present the same way that the paperwork expected her to.
Well,
so it took a long time. So yeah, I really feel like the whole system, it just needs an accountable person, a minister, it's somebody like that to make it change from the top up.
Well,
yeah, to actually make it change. Because at the moment, I don't see anything can change without reform from the whole process.
Thank you very much for joining us and talking to us about that. And I hope you get an assessment relatively quickly. Can I just talk to you, Henry, briefly before we go about the assisted dying bill? Let me just show you this tweet from Jessica Elgott, Guardian journalist. Assisted dying bill committee is expected to be announced today. But as Paul Brand, ITV, also reports, there's some consternation over the composition. A number of the prominent Labour opponents of the bill, including those who promised to work constructively, are not on it. What does this all mean?
So the Bill Committee, that happens for every piece of legislation, but usually we don't really pay much attention. It matters here because one of the key promises made by Kim Leadbeater, the Labour MP who was bringing this assisted dying legislation, was that this Bill Committee would be more powerful than many Bill Committees, would be able to call for evidence, and crucially would span the spectrum of opinion in the House of Commons on this. And I think it is going to span the spectrum, although a majority will be supporters, as they were in the House of Commons in the last vote. But the question of which opponents go on there does seem to be slightly controversial.
Well, you were a clear opponent of the bill. Will you be on it, this Bill Committee?
So I've asked Kim Leadbeater to put me on it. As I said before, I believe in the principle of autonomy with people with full decision-making capacity, but I have grave concerns about the implementation of the bill. Let's see what Kim Leadbeater announces later, and I think we'll see how she's going to approach this whole process. I've had concerns pretty much from the start that this is not the way we should do this sort of legislation.
Are you confident it'll be fair enough, the way they actually divvy up who's on the committee?
Let's see what comes out later. Like I say, I'm concerned. Legislation of this magnitude, this is not the way we should be doing it.
It's all we have time for today. Thank you very much to all of my guests. I'll be back tomorrow with more Politics Live at 12:15 here on BBC Two and the iPlayer. Have a good afternoon.